The unemployment rate in South Africa has dropped slightly. The results of the quarterly labour force survey for the fourth quarter of 2016 indicate that employment grew by 235,000 and the number of job seekers declined by 92,000.
This resulted in a slight decline in the unemployment rate by 0.6% of a percentage point to 26.5%. The growth in employment was mainly driven by the services industry, which grew by 73,000, followed by transport, which grew by 46,000, and by manufacturing, which added 44,000 jobs. All other industries reported quarter-on-quarter employment growth except mining and construction.
Now, for more on this, we are now joined in our Pretoria studios by Statistician General for Statistics South Africa, Dr. Pali Lehohla. Dr. Lehohla, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Now, let's firstly look at the slight improvement in the jobs data. Quite a low figure still. What does this point to exactly?
Well, I think generally the numbers have increased, particularly in manufacturing. But if you look at year on year, you'll see that a year ago, manufacturing had 10,000 more jobs than they do now. So manufacturing has lost jobs year on year. So quarter on quarter movements are important, but we also have to look at year on year movements. More importantly, the quarter of October to December is a quarter where you expect more people to be employed. So there isn't anything much more untoward in what we have seen. The only thing is, yes, we see a surge in employment in manufacturing as well as in other services, particularly transport as well as telecommunications. What is important, I think, in the figures for people in policy to look at, what are the interrelationships between the sectors where growth has occurred, so that we can use the supply and use kind of tables from national accounts to try and understand whether this real growth is possible or not. But looking at it just as growth, unemployment has dropped by 0.5, is not useful at all. When we have also elicited a few points around graduate unemployment, particularly of those who are 15 to 34. Those who are in tertiary, and also by race, showing that there are serious problems around black graduates in terms of getting jobs relative to their counterparts who are Indians and whites. So I think a headline figure of a drop of 0.6 is absolutely useless unless it's contextualized in the micro numbers that are embedded in the labor force survey.
Now, before we unpack more of the numbers, let's look at the demographics behind the employment figures. Does it continue to indicate widening inequality?
Well, we released a living conditions survey which showed that inequality is it's a serious problem, particularly amongst blacks. Although the incomes are low, inequality is highest there. The Gini coefficient is in the region of 0.59, whereas amongst whites it's about 0.40, and amongst Indians it has been declining. And those kinds of things talk to social cohesion. The report that we released on victims of crime points to a very difficult situation in society around who perpetrates crime, is it reported, the confidence and everything. All those numbers are related. And that's the point we want to make, that we can't look at just one number. We must look at them as a system that tells us what is actually happening.
Now, Dr. Lehohla, you mentioned the sectors that have done well in terms of creating jobs. In terms of that, can that be attributed to perhaps specific interventions by government or the private sector?
It's very difficult to say now what might be, but certainly the jobs have been created both in government and in the private sector. So attribution is quite possible. Is it because there is a better demand climate outside and exports? That is still to be seen. But certainly we see a change in the numbers of employment. But I've also said that every fourth quarter, numbers of people who are employed increases because of the demands over Christmas.
Let's look at the contentious issue of skills development and the sentiment that there are jobs, but people are qualified for the incorrect sectors. Is this a skewed observation or an accurate one?
The one that just come again.
I was saying that let's look at the sentiment that they are actually jobs, but people are qualified for perhaps the incorrect sectors. Is that an accurate sentiment?
Well, it's difficult to say whether it's accurate or not accurate, but what we do know is that unemployment levels amongst black graduates is higher than unemployment amongst white graduates, Indian graduates, and colored graduates. And it's worse for those who are out of tertiary and TVETs. The question is, are these people exposed to the same kind of education? Are the employers selective by race in terms of choosing who should they get? All those things are things that we have to unpack given our very sad history. It's not clear what is happening in that space, and it would be too early to prejudge that situation.
Now, with regards to inflation, what can we expect the MPC's direction to be going forward?
I think what we have to ask ourselves, and the numbers have to challenge people in policy, is if unemployment has to be 14% by 2020 in terms of the NDP, what has to change? Because what has happened since 2008 and 2001 has not changed the equation in the job market. It hasn't changed dramatically the absorption rates. The absorption rates, in fact, have become lower since 2008. Unemployment has hovered and around 25% all this time. So what are the kinds of interventions? And what we also see is that there is a lot of mechanization that replaces labor. Now, faced with a labor force that is not so educated and trained, what are the kinds of interventions that have to take us forward? Also given the fourth industrial revolution. So it means that we have to conceive and work on things much more differently, and these numbers are at the heart of that work.
Now, we know that the improvement in the jobs figures are pointing to overall improvement for the economy. When will we start to see significant economic growth?
I do not know. I wish I did. If I did, I would have thrown the bones and said, this is what we will see in the future. We will be releasing the GDP figures for the fourth quarter, and we'll see what that tells us. I can't predict really at this point in time. But what we have seen is GDP growth and employment. Yes, they mimic one another or each other. That growth in employment follows that. But we also have seen that in the economy as it goes, manufacturing and mining, people are beginning to mechanize, employing technology and less people. And that's the reality that we are facing going forward.
Dr. Lehohla, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us on SABC News. That was Statistician General for StatSA, Dr. Pali Lehohla.